Thank you everyone for coming tonight. My name is Jose Enrique Gonzalez and I am with Eric Martindale. Today we're going to be discussing Bitcoin versus the Valkyrie Bitcoin Futures ETF. And before we get started with anything, I want to thank Eric Martindale for coming along and giving us the opportunity to learn a little bit from his perspective and what he sees. And without further ado, I want to ask Eric to introduce himself, tell us a bit about who you are and how you got into Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Eric Martindale is my full name, at Martindale on Twitter, anywhere. So Bitcoin to me kind of came across my table from the libertarian angle. So I was previously pretty pissed off and upset about what was happening during the financial crisis. I'd already been following a lot of the Ron Pauls and people who were talking about the egregious fouls that the government was imposing on the population through their monetary policies. So I was already pretty curious, but I was not as informed. So I think it was probably 2010, 2011 originally when I first came across Bitcoin for the first time. I was a programmer, an engineer, a hacker, if you will, someone who just writes code on their nights and weekends as much as I can to build the things that I wanted to build. So when I saw Bitcoin, it was mostly, for me, an initial answer to the government's control over the monetary system. Then, as I went down the rabbit hole and learned more about the technical capabilities of Bitcoin, it became so much more to me. It became a tool not only for liberating people from financial oppression and giving them their free speech and freedom of moving their money back, but it became a way to build new systems which did not rely on any trusted third party. And ultimately, that just became a passion of mine. You know, I became the crazy person who was talking to their parents and family at Thanksgiving dinner, telling them about Bitcoin. I was running around to every business. This is like probably 2013, 2012. I was trying to convince every business in my hometown to accept Bitcoin, because this is the future of money, right? This is going to change everything. And so, things played out. We've had several waves. It seems to be trending upward, at least priced in government money. But yeah, that's how I came into Bitcoin. And ultimately, all of that effort, I had even written some open source projects that had gained some attention. And so I ultimately received an offer from a Bitcoin company at the time, BitPay. I worked with them for 2 years to help them do business services for accepting Bitcoin as a currency at your business. And then I went later on to work at Blockstream for 2 more years after that. They're also a technology company building things on top of Bitcoin. And now I obviously run my own thing now, which is called Puerto. And I guess we'll get into that later, but that's how I got into Bitcoin.
Can you repeat the name of that, please?
Portal?
Portal? Oh, excellent. So, I think we can all agree we've had our evangelist phase. Everyone that gets into Bitcoin has their evangelist phase. The question is, do you get out of it? And, that varies, right? You mentioned the rabbit hole, and I know the rabbit hole is steep, right? And I want to keep our audience with us. So, Bitcoin is complicated. We know that. Can you give us a brief overview of what Bitcoin is, not just to you, but to the world?
Yeah, Bitcoin is the ultimate self-sovereign money. It is a monetary system in which you have guarantees about its properties. You know its supply. You know the security of the system as measured by the amount of energy that it would take to reverse a transaction or rewrite the history of the shared ledger. And ultimately, it's an expression of your self-sovereignty, your speech. There was a case in the United States, Citizens United in the 90s, 94, 95, 96, somewhere in there. And the court ruled, actually, that money is free speech. Because if you choose, if your expression of speech is how you choose money, then money is an extension of free speech. And I buy that argument. So, to me, Bitcoin is the tip of the spear to eliminate government control over our finances and our monies, and allows us, it's like the ultimate savings technology. The government tends to print more and more money over time, making your dollars worth less and less. Whereas Bitcoin, you have a very predictable supply, you know exactly what you're getting into. So I think ultimately it is, like I said, the ultimate self-sovereign money and an expression of speech.
Yeah, in the line of it being ultimate self-sovereign money, ETFs are not self-sovereign. I'm gonna go on a limb here and just say that. Can you tell us a bit about what an ETF is, and honestly, why in terms of sovereignty it's different to Bitcoin?
Yeah, so traditional financial services, come under the government's regulatory regime, and there are certain rules and laws and things that you have to comply with. If you move more than a certain amount of money, or you're dealing with certain institutions, you have to report it, or it's just not allowed in some cases. So Bitcoin is self-sovereign, meaning only you control it, right? Whereas these traditional financial institutions, however, they require custody, which means with a traditional bank, you have to deposit your money into the bank, and the bank holds on to your money for you. Theoretically, they give you some nice little percentage point in return for giving them your money. But ultimately, with Bitcoin, you don't need that. But an ETF is an exchange-traded fund, an exchange-traded fund. And it's really, in my opinion, it's strictly for the institutional investors. For me, I use Bitcoin every day, and I don't comply with government regulations. Okay, right? Like I just don't. Okay, I'm a free man, and I use my Bitcoin how I please. With an ETF, it's the same thing as the traditional custodian relationship with a bank. You're asking them to hold on to your asset for you. You don't need that with Bitcoin. Just buy a Trezor, buy a hardware wallet, set up multi-sig, and you are your own bank now. And I think that's really what it's about for me.
Thank you. P.S. We do not give financial or legal advice, and this show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Okay, so you kind of broke down the ETF pretty well, and that sovereignty, you hit the nail on the head with the sovereignty, man. The custody, it really affects the control we get to exercise over whatever asset we have. So now I want to dive into the Valkyrie, specifically the Valkyrie Bitcoin's Futures ETF that debuted last week on the New York Stock Exchange, and it went pretty well from what I understand. So can you tell us a bit about this and whether you think it's good or bad for the general Bitcoin ecosystem?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the volumes, but I do know that Valkyrie is the first of, I think there's probably 7 or 8 ETFs, Bitcoin-specific ETFs, in the approval pipeline, and this has been the case for well over a year and a half, probably 2 to 3 years now. I think the Winklevis were doing it, and there's a lot of applications. It just so happens this was one of the first, right? I think there's also GBTC as well. So, I think that it is a slight distraction. I think for those that are willing to be compliant with an oppressive government, I think this is their vehicle. Okay, this is the vehicle if people want to be compliant, right? So this is for more institutional investors. This is not necessarily for the average mom and pop. I really don't think. I think this is for not the Michael Saylors per se, but the companies that are looking to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets while not having to take on the risks and difficulty of managing that Bitcoin on their own. Now, from an individualist perspective, that's not, the whole point of it is self-sovereignty, so why would you give up custody of your Bitcoin? But at the same time, the institutional investor, that's something they're already familiar with. That's something that they're already doing. They're already used to taking out loans based on cash flow from the bank, and the bank holds their money, and it's wild. But again, it is the institutionals, it's the organizations, it's the large groups with large holdings, I think, ultimately, that this is going to be interesting for. However, I do think it is a distraction from that core message, right? As we've seen Bitcoin grow, as we've seen the crypto ecosystem grow, it seems to me that people are less and less aware of the privacy implications, the self-sovereignty implications, and so subsequently, I'm not hopeful. I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic about people continuing to understand why Bitcoin was created in the first place. And it's a movement that goes all the way back to the late 80s. I think the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto was published, I think, in 1988 or 89. The Cypherpunk Manifesto, I think, was published in 2001. And so, yeah, I think those core messages, there are conversations in the community about privacy, about self-sovereignty, about that. But as each successive wave of adoption hits, as more and more individuals get involved, as more and more organizations get involved, they tend to miss that core message. Bitcoin was explicitly created to be a digital, self-sovereign, peer-to-peer cash, right? So I think this moving towards custodianship, I'm not really a big fan of it. I think it's pretty obvious, but I think it is helpful for organizations that are seeking exposure that do not currently have it.
Let me organize my thoughts for a second. So I wanted to say something earlier when you brought up, you basically distinguished who an ETF was for and who Bitcoin was for. I wanted to add a note, some razzle dazzle, and say that ETFs are for the people that the government works for. Perhaps not us. And I definitely concur with what you're saying in regards to people straying away or skimming over these fundamental messages and these fundamental attributes that are frankly fundamental. Again, sorry for being so redundant, but are fundamental to Bitcoin, and people just skim over them. One of them happens to be privacy, that you brought up. It isn't the subject of this discussion, but you know, the future of privacy is worrisome. Like, we're looking at an ultra transparent world, and whoever has the math power is able to track anybody down for what they're spending. But that is another rabbit hole on its own.
It is a big rabbit hole. So, I mean, at least in the United States, we do have a constitutional right to privacy, unreasonable search and seizure by government agents, right? We have the right to not quarter soldiers in our homes, for example. But since the 2001 Patriot Act passed, so since 9/11, since the terrorist attacks, the government, with the Patriot Act, they wildly expanded their surveillance panopticon, quite frankly. Yeah. It is totally antithetical in my mind to what it means to be an American, or what the United States is supposed to represent, which is the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But I have I've transitioned, I should say, over the years from that libertarian angle where we let people be free to a minarchist, where, you know, maybe we still need a little bit of government. To honestly, at this point, I'm a full-blown anarchist. I think the world would be a vastly better place if, you know, governments, you know, like Communist Party of China, Russia. I mean, even here in the United States, we have serious degrees of oppression. But ultimately, I think Bitcoin is going to win that battle. Now, I think the state will continue to exist for a long time, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on any of you who still believe that the government should exist, but hopefully I'll convince you over time, maybe over the near future.
Yeah. A quick note on unreasonable search and seizure. So I'm writing this small law school article about Bitcoin and criminal procedure, specifically like blockchain and evidence. And there's this rather new case from 2019, 2018, where the Supreme Court determines that the blockchain is a public ledger, right? So if the government, you know, gets on the blockchain and figures out your address and tracks you down and follows your Bitcoin all over, it's not an unreasonable search because there's no expectation of privacy. So we should bring back the conversation. But
I'm happy to talk about that, though, by the way.
It was good. Do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I mean, yeah, that's one ruling, but I can use Bitcoin in a way that I do have a reasonable expectation of privacy. I can use these things called submarine swaps. I can use CoinJoin. I can use Join Market. I can just use a traditional Bitcoin mixer. Again, not legal advice or any of that shit, but pardon my language. But I do think Bitcoin will become that, and I think there will be a giant fight about it because the government does not have an incentive to protect individual privacy. They have an incentive to expand the surveillance state. They do not have an incentive to decrease it or minimize it.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that because the more they know about you, the more they can tax you. So this privacy conversation is like a whole like meetup on its own. So bringing it back to the Bitcoin versus Valkyrie Bitcoin futures ETF, we pretty much covered all the points, and I wanted to ask you if there was someone new that came to you to ask for non-legal, non-financial advice, right? And they were undecided between whether they wanted to invest in Bitcoin or invest in the Valkyrie ETF. And you know, recognizing that you distinguish between institutional investors and individual investors earlier, what would you tell this noob about getting started, and really what should he do in your opinion?
Yeah, so I would actually even lean towards a traditional financial advice of hedging your bets. I mean, it's my belief that the government will continue to inflate the money supply. I think that is also supported by evidence. I think it would be ridiculous as a newcomer to the space for you not to have at least some Bitcoin. Just have some. It is the ultimate hedge against the government inflating your money into a piece of toilet paper.
And I'm going to agree with that. So I want to thank Eric for coming out. If anybody in the audience has any questions for Eric, please feel free to let me know so that I can pass you the mic. Eric worked at both BitPay and Blockstream. If you don't know, they are epic companies. I think BitPay, they launched the first like Bitcoin debit card. Yep. And they had the Visa logo and everything. There's drama behind it, I think. But you know, epic companies from an epic guy. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to bring them up.
Yeah, if anybody does have questions, feel free to come on up. I'd love taking questions. But I do want to highlight my current company, Puerto. So after leaving both of those companies, now I'm working on this, not only a self-hosted wallet, a self-sovereign wallet for multiple currencies, but also we're going to have a built-in exchange that uses the actual atomic swap components so that you don't have to use a centralized custody to trade your funds. So,
yeah. I think we had a question, but regarding Portal, I'm going to make sure that we include a link on the description after the video is edited. So, did you have a question?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, do you mind coming over here? Here you go. Here you go.
Thanks. Okay, so for someone who's completely kind of oblivious to Bitcoin, like how would I get started? You know, what is the minimum amount I should invest? I mean, maybe just like some kind of beginner's tips. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, the very first thing to note about this self-sovereign concept is not your keys, not your coin, right? So if you turn over your keys or you're trusting some other service to host your wallet or host your Bitcoin like Coinbase or blockchain.info or any of these existing service providers, if you don't have a backup, a actual copy of the what's called the private key, which is the one piece of information, it's the one thing that actually stays scarce, I would say, in Bitcoin. It's the one thing that's actually secret. That's the thing that unlocks all of your funds. So most importantly, make sure you are not using these custodial services, because those are businesses that can get shut down. Those are businesses that the government can come in and halt all of their transactions. Not your keys, not your coin. So if you're using one of these custodialized services, it's not the path for you. There are a lot of educational resources out there. We talk about this rabbit hole. I'm still going down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin development. I'm still learning things about Bitcoin after 10 years that I did not know before. So this is, I usually tell people it's probably a 2-year full process for people to like really just kind of understand the full aspect of it, or at least the meat of it. but getting started is really not hard, right? You can acquire Bitcoin. You can acquire $5 worth of Bitcoin, right? You can do what we call in the community stacking sats. Sats is the smallest current unit of Bitcoin. There's 100 million sats, or Satoshi, named after the original creator, to one whole Bitcoin. And so the smallest transaction, the smallest amount of Bitcoin that can exist is actually smaller than a penny, right? So this is actually a technical thing that I enjoy. Is there's lots of things that you can do technically now with money you couldn't do before. PayPal used to charge 40 or 35 cents plus a percentage fee on these microtransactions. So that's a thing you can do. But in terms of being a newcomer, YouTube. There's lots of podcasts are probably really, there's a huge community of Bitcoin podcasts. They're really easy to listen to while you work, while you draw, drive, whatever. And really keep in mind that you have to keep that. The most important thing about self-sovereign assets, you may no longer be trusting a bank, but they were keeping your money somewhat secure in that system, right? So you have to take on that responsibility of keeping your own keys, making backups, storing your backups securely. So you kind of got to get in that habit, because for too long we've been, sort of trusting these institutions, and we've lost the ability to kind of keep track of our own stuff in a lot of ways. So really, not your keys, not your coin is probably the single biggest thing that I can say. And if you don't get the opportunity to get a private key backup out of that wallet, there's a very high likelihood that you will eventually lose that money. So really, I recommend you keep it on your own devices, etc. So
I'm going to add to that these institutions, I would argue, they don't even make it hard for you to keep track of your money. They just, they took away your power. They control it now, and we're on their terms, So my two thoughts. Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Eric once again. This has been the Crypto Happy Hour. You can catch this live stream on YouTube and Facebook. So, nada. Take care, everyone.
Awesome.